The air in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel hummed with the electric current of power. It was a symphony of clinking champagne flutes, hushed negotiations disguised as pleasantries, and the silent, ruthless calculus of ambition. For Jonathan Vance, this was the oxygen he craved. He smoothed the lapels of his custom-tailored Brioni suit, a tangible symbol of how far he'd come from the man who used to eat ramen noodles over a drafting table. Tonight, at the annual Sterling Foundation Innovators Gala, he was on the hunt. His architectural firm was on the verge of greatness, and securing the Sterling Foundation's landmark urban redevelopment project would be his coronation. He scanned the gilded room, his eyes sharp and calculating, searching for the face that could change his life. He never imagined that the face he would find would be the one he'd spent the last 5 years trying to forget. Jonathan Vance considered himself an architect of destiny, not just of buildings. His life was a blueprint, each stage meticulously planned and executed. The early years, the ones he shared with Abigail Reed, were the foundation necessary, perhaps, but meant to be built upon and ultimately hidden beneath a more impressive facade. He sipped his Macallan 18, the smoky peat, a familiar comfort, and surveyed the glittering assembly. Here were the titans of industry, the political kingmakers, the old money scions of New York. This was his world now. He belonged here. His firm, Vance Designs, had clawed its way to prominence. He had a sleek office overlooking Bryant Park, a portfolio of chic minimalist residential towers that were the darlings of architectural magazines, and a reputation for being ruthlessly efficient. He'd achieved this by shedding dead weight, and in his mind Abigail had been the heaviest burden. He remembered her as a creature of soft edges and muted colors. She was the quiet hum in the background of his life, the steady job as a research assistant at the university library that paid their bills. The warm meals waiting for him. After he'd spent 18 hours obsessing over a design competition, he'd ultimately lose the gentle hands that would rub the tension from his shoulders as he raged against a world that didn't yet recognize his genius. She was comfortable. And for a man who wanted to conquer the world, comfortable was a synonym for complacent. Their apartment back then had been a reflection of her, filled with second-hand books, wildflowers in jam jars, and her quiet, persistent passion for art history. He'd called it clutter. She had a project, something about restoring damaged frescoes in a small, forgotten church upstate. She would spend hours poring over dusty tomes, her brow furrowed in concentration, her notes filled with detailed chemical compositions for cleaning agents and sketches of damaged cherubs. He'd patronized her, calling it her little hobby. "Abby, it's a church nobody's heard of," he'd said one night, gesturing dismissively at her scattered research papers which were encroaching on his own blueprints. "Who cares about some faded paint on a ceiling? I'm designing the future. Skyscrapers that will scrape the heavens. That's legacy." She had looked up at him, her gray eyes, usually so soft, holding a flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher. Preserving the past is its own kind of future, Jonathan. It's about remembering who we were. It's a legacy of a different kind. He'd laughed. It was a condescending, cutting sound. That was the moment he decided she couldn't see his vision. She was a footnote, and he was destined to be the headline. The divorce had been swift and sterile. He told her he needed space to grow, that he had outgrown them. It was a lie of omission. He had already met Cassandra, a gallery owner with a razor-sharp bob and a contact list that was a veritable who's who of the city's elite. Cassandra understood ambition. She understood the transactional nature of relationships in their world. Abigail had just cried, packed her books and her wildflowers, and disappeared. He'd felt a pang of something, not guilt, he told himself, but annoyance at the inconvenience of it all. He sent her a check, a sum he considered generous, and considered the chapter closed. Now, 5 years later, Cassandra was long gone, replaced by a succession of similarly ambitious women. His success was undeniable, yet there was a hollowness to it, a phantom limb-like ache he couldn't diagnose. He ignored it, channeling all his energy into the next acquisition, the next victory. tonight that victory was the Sterling Grand Concourse project. It was a visionary plan to revitalize a derelict section of the city's industrial waterfront, and the man behind it was the reclusive, almost mythical billionaire Alistair Sterling. Sterling wasn't just rich, he was a kingmaker. His endorsement would catapult Vance designs into the stratosphere. Jonathan's target for the evening was Robert Harrington Sterling's right-hand man and the gatekeeper to the throne. He spotted Harrington near the orchestra, a stout man with a booming laugh. Making his approach, Jonathan deployed the easy charm that was his most effective tool. "Robert, a pleasure to see you," he said, extending a hand. "Jonathan Vance. I believe my office has been in touch regarding the Grand Concourse." Harrington gave him a firm handshake and a non-committal smile. Vance. "Yes, your proposal was ambitious. The committee is still in deliberation. Mr. Sterling is a man who values vision, but also substance." "Substance is my specialty," Jonathan said smoothly. "My designs aren't just structures, they're statements about the future of urban living." As he spoke, his gaze drifted across the room, a predator's instinct scanning for rivals and opportunities. And then he saw her. She was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the park, her back partially to him. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that seemed to drink the light. It was simple, elegant, and devastatingly effective. It wasn't the dress that caught him, but her posture. A straight, confident spine, the graceful curve of her neck, a quiet command of her space that drew the eye without demanding it. There was a familiarity to it that pricked at the edges of his memory, a ghost of a gesture. He saw her turn her head slightly to speak to the person beside her, and the light caught the sweep of her dark hair, now styled in a sophisticated chignon that exposed the nape of her neck. A jolt went through him, a strange and unwelcome sense of déjà vu. He faltered for a second, losing the thread of his conversation with Harrington. "You were saying," Harrington prompted, his eyebrow raised. "Yes," the substance Jonathan recovered, forcing his attention back. But his eyes kept straying to the woman in the emerald dress. He felt an inexplicable pull, an annoying curiosity. Who was she? He was certain he knew every woman of consequence in this city. This one, however, was a mystery, and Jonathan Vance hated mysteries he couldn't solve. The woman in the emerald dress became an enigma that dominated Jonathan's focus for the next hour. He extricated himself from the conversation with Harrington, his mind buzzing. He moved through the ballroom with a feigned casualness, his eyes always returning to her. She was now in conversation with a senator and his wife, and she wasn't just listening politely. She was engaged. Her expressions animated, her hands moving with a fluid grace as she made a point. The senator, a man known for his blustering self-importance, was listening intently, nodding with genuine respect. This was not the behavior of a socialite or a +1. This was a woman who commanded attention through sheer presence. He edged closer, trying to catch a snippet of their conversation, but the orchestra swelled, drowning out their words. He saw her laugh, a full, genuine laugh that reached her eyes. The sound or the memory of what that sound might be sent another shiver of unease down his spine. He retreated to the bar, his mind racing. Who is she? He ran through the mental Rolodex of faces and names he'd collected over the years. Was she a tech heiress from the West Coast? A European aristocrat? A newly emerged art world prodigy? None of them fit. There was something about her that was both grounded and ethereal, a combination he found deeply unsettling. His memory of Abigail was hazy, softened by time and his own self-serving narrative. He remembered her in faded jeans and oversized sweaters. He remembered her hands often smudged with ink or soil from her small herb garden on their fire escape. He remembered her face as pleasingly pretty but not striking. Not a showstopper. Not a woman who could hold a senator captive with a conversation. The woman across the room was a masterpiece of polished elegance. Her skin glowed under the chandelier light. Her jewelry, a simple but clearly significant diamond and emerald necklace, was understated and exquisite. She was art. Abigail, he recalled with a flicker of the old impatience, was just the quiet, unassuming librarian who curated it. He flagged down a waiter. "Excuse me, do you happen to know who that woman is? The one in the green dress speaking with Senator Albright." The waiter, a young man with sharp eyes, glanced over. "I'm not sure of her name, sir, but she arrived with Mr. Sterling." The name hit Jonathan like a splash of cold water. Alistair Sterling. Of course. The woman was with the most powerful man in the room. This changed the calculus entirely. Was she his daughter? A niece? A senior executive in his global empire? The most likely and most uninteresting possibility was that she was his girlfriend, a beautiful, intelligent woman to adorn the arm of a reclusive billionaire. It was a common enough story in these circles, but it didn't feel right. There was no trace of the cloying deference or watchful anxiety that usually accompanied such arrangements. She stood beside Alistair Sterling when he eventually joined her group, not as a subordinate or a decoration, but as an equal. He was a tall, silver-haired man with an aura of immense quiet power, yet his focus was entirely on her. He would lean in to hear her speak. His eyes, famous for their intimidating shrewdness, were soft with what looked like genuine admiration and affection. Jonathan felt a prickle of something he refused to name as jealousy. It was professional envy, he told himself. She had the ear of the man he needed to impress. He watched them for a while longer. He saw the way Sterling touched the small of her back, a gesture of familiarity and possession, yet also profound respect. He saw the easy smile she gave him in return, a private, intimate communication in a room full of 1,000 eyes. He decided he needed a different angle. He found David Chen, a journalist for a high-profile financial magazine who knew everyone. "David, good to see you," Jonathan began, clapping him on the shoulder. "Great piece on the Zurich acquisition last month." "Jonathan." "Thanks," David said, taking a sip of his drink. "Trying to get a word with the man of the hour myself. Sterling's been invisible for 6 months. Everyone wants to know what he's planning." "Speaking of which," Jonathan said, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "who's the woman he's with, the one in emerald? She's causing quite a stir." David followed his gaze and squinted. "That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Or rather, the billion-dollar question. She appeared on the scene about a year ago. Nobody knows much. Her name is Abigail. Just Abigail. She's been seen with him at a few private events, but this is her first major public appearance. Some say she's a former art historian he hired to manage his private collection. Others say they met at a conference in Florence. The consensus is that she's the new Mrs. Sterling. Abigail. The name echoed in the cavern of Jonathan's mind. It was a common name. It meant nothing. A coincidence. He repeated it to himself. Abigail. Abigail. Abby. The sound was so familiar, yet so alien in this context. His Abby was quiet. His Abby was simple. His Abby would be utterly lost in a room like this, shrinking into a corner, intimidated by the wealth and power. He looked back at the woman. She was not shrinking. She was incandescent. And then he saw it. She turned her head again, catching the light at a specific angle. For a split second, he saw the faint silvery trace of a scar just above her left eyebrow. A tiny, almost invisible mark she'd gotten as a child falling out of a tree. He used to trace it with his thumb late at night when their limbs were tangled together in their small, cramped bed. It was a detail so intimate, so specific, so deeply buried in the archives of his memory that its appearance here in this ballroom on this woman felt like a physical impossibility. His breath caught in his throat. The glass in his hand felt suddenly heavy. The confident hum of the room faded to a dull roar in his ears. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But the scar was there. And as his mind frantically tried to reconcile the two images, the mousy, bookish girl in a faded sweater and the radiant, confident woman in emerald silk, he realized with a dawning, sickening horror that the architecture of her face, the curve of her smile, the intelligence in her eyes, it was all the same. It had just been polished to a brilliant, blinding sheen. The foundation was the same one he had abandoned, convinced it was worthless. Now someone else had built a palace upon it. The woman who had arrived with Alistair Sterling, the woman who was captivating senators and holding the attention of billionaires, the woman everyone was calling the new Mrs. Sterling, was his ex-wife. It was Abigail. The world tilted on its axis. The Macallan turned to ash in Jonathan's mouth. He felt a wave of vertigo, as if the floor of the grand ballroom had suddenly dropped away, leaving him suspended in a state of nauseating disbelief. Every certainty he had built his life upon began to fracture. He stared, no longer trying to hide his attention. He was a statue frozen in the middle of the glittering, swirling current of the gala. He traced the lines of her face with his eyes, desperately searching for a flaw in his logic, a reason this couldn't be true. But the more he looked, the more the impossible became undeniable. The way she tilted her head when she was listening intently. The small gesture she made with her left hand, a habit she had when she was explaining something she was passionate about. These were Abigail's mannerisms, gestures he had once known better than his own. He had just never seen them deployed with such effortless confidence on such a grand stage. The woman he remembered was a rough sketch. This was a finished oil painting rich with color depth and a value he had been utterly blind to. His mind reeled, trying to process the chain of events that could possibly lead from their dingy queen's apartment to this. Abigail Reed, the research assistant who bought her clothes from thrift stores, was now Abigail Sterling, wife of a man whose net worth was larger than the GDP of several small countries. It was a fairy tale of such absurd proportions that it felt like a hallucination. A wave of bitter, acidic resentment washed over him. How had she, of all people, managed this? Had she played the long game, a secret schemer hiding behind a facade of gentle simplicity? Had she targeted Sterling? The idea was almost laughable. Abigail wouldn't have known how to be a gold digger if she'd had a map and a shovel. She was too sincere, too earnest. The lights in the ballroom began to dim, and a hush fell over the crowd as Robert Harrington took the stage. A spotlight found him at the podium. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Harrington's voice boomed, "and welcome to the Sterling Foundation Innovators Gala. Tonight we are here to celebrate not just innovation in technology and industry, but also a bold new direction for the foundation. For years, Alistair Sterling has quietly been one of the world's foremost patrons of the arts. Tonight we are thrilled to officially announce the launch of the Sterling Foundation's most ambitious project to date, the Cultural Heritage Initiative. A polite but enthusiastic applause rippled through the room. Jonathan barely heard it. His eyes were locked on Abigail, who was now standing beside the stage with Alistair Sterling bathed in the soft, peripheral glow of the spotlight. This multi-billion-dollar initiative, Harrington continued, will be dedicated to identifying, restoring, and preserving artistic and architectural treasures around the globe that are at risk of being lost to time, conflict, or neglect. To lead this monumental undertaking, a visionary was needed. Someone with not only a deep scholarly understanding of history, but the passion and tenacity to bring the past into the future. It is my distinct honor to introduce the man whose vision continues to reshape our world, Mr. Alistair Sterling. Alistair Sterling walked onto the stage to a thunderous ovation. He was, as the legends described, formidable, radiating a quiet intensity that made the microphone in front of him seem superfluous. He held up a hand and the room fell silent. "Thank you, Robert," Sterling said, his voice a calm, resonant baritone. "For decades I have built things, corporations, technologies, financial instruments, things that are by their nature ephemeral. They are replaced by the next innovation, the next quarter's earnings. But the legacy of humanity, our true story, is not written in stock tickers. It is carved in stone, painted on plaster, and woven into the fabric of our shared culture." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before landing with unmistakable warmth on Abigail. "I cannot take credit for the vision behind the Cultural Heritage Initiative," he continued, a genuine smile gracing his lips. The credit for that belongs to someone who taught me that the most valuable assets are not the ones you can find on a balance sheet. Someone whose brilliance and passion for history are matched only by her kindness and strength. She is the heart and mind of this initiative. She is its driving force. And I am the luckiest man in the world to call her my partner in all things. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the chair of the Sterling Cultural Heritage Initiative, my wife Abigail Sterling. The name struck Jonathan like a physical blow. Abigail Sterling. He watched in a state of suspended animation as she ascended the few steps to the stage. She didn't walk, she glided. The emerald silk of her gown flowed around her, and the spotlight embraced her as if she were born to it. She kissed her husband on the cheek and turned to face the audience, and then she began to speak. Her voice was not the quiet, hesitant voice he remembered. It was clear, confident, and filled with an incandescent passion that captivated the entire room. She spoke of the forgotten frescoes of provincial Italy, the crumbling facades of colonial architecture in South America, the digital preservation of ancient manuscripts. She spoke with an authority and an erudition that was breathtaking. The little hobby he had mocked had become a global crusade. The faded paint on a ceiling she had cared about was now the centerpiece of a multi-billion-dollar philanthropic empire. She was magnificent. And in that moment, as he watched her hold a room of the world's most powerful people in the palm of her hand, Jonathan Vance didn't just feel shock or envy. He felt a profound and terrifying sense of loss. He hadn't just divorced a woman, he had discarded a treasure. He hadn't just failed to recognize her worth, he had failed to recognize that she was the one with the real vision all along. He was the architect, but she was the one building a legacy that would actually last. As Abigail's voice, eloquent and assured, filled the ballroom, the carefully constructed edifice of Jonathan's life began to crumble brick by painful brick. Each word she spoke was a testament to a world he had never bothered to see, a depth he had never cared to explore. The present faded, and he was plunged into the cold, sharp waters of the past, the memories now recontextualized and rendered in excruciating detail. He remembered a Saturday afternoon years ago. He was hunched over his drafting table, furious because his design for a local library competition had been rejected as technically proficient but emotionally sterile. Abigail had walked in, her cheeks flushed with excitement. In her hands she held a tattered leather-bound book she'd found in a dusty corner of the university archives. "Jonathan, you have to see this," she had whispered, her voice filled with reverence. "It's a first-edition treatise by Alberti from the 15th century. Look at the diagrams, the way he talks about harmony and proportion, not just as mathematical principles, but as a reflection of divine natural beauty. He says a building should speak to the soul." He had barely glanced up. "Abby, I'm busy. I don't have time for dusty old books. I'm trying to create something new, not rehash what some dead Italian did 500 years ago." "But don't you see?" She had pressed her enthusiasm undimmed. "It's not about rehashing. It's about understanding the foundation, the soul. Maybe that's what the judges meant about your design. It's perfect, but it doesn't sing." "Sing," he'd scoffed, a cruel smirk on his face. "Buildings don't sing, Abby. They stand. They function. They make a statement. Your problem is you're too romantic. You live in a fairy tale." He turned back to his drawings, a clear dismissal. He remembered the silence that followed the soft click of the door as she left the room, taking her discovery and her wounded excitement with her. Now on the stage, Abigail was quoting Alberti. She was speaking about how the Cultural Heritage Initiative wasn't just about applying modern technology to old problems, but about recapturing the original soul, the song of the art they were saving. The entire room was rapt, hanging on the very words he had dismissed as fairy tale nonsense. Another memory surfaced, sharper this time, more damning. It was their last anniversary. He had forgotten. He came home late, smelling of the expensive perfume of a potential client he'd been charming over cocktails. Abigail had been waiting a simple home-cooked meal on their small table, a single candle flickering. She wasn't angry, just visibly disappointed. "I'm sorry, Abby," he'd said, the apology thin and automatic. "I was working. I'm closing in on the Miller contract. This is for us." "Is it?" she had asked, her voice quiet. "It feels like it's for you, Jonathan. I had an idea I wanted to talk to you about. I found a way to get a small grant enough to start a pilot program for the church restoration project. I'd have to go upstate for a few weeks to do the initial assessment. I thought, maybe we could go together. Make it a trip." He had stared at her as if she'd suggested they move to the moon. "A few weeks upstate. To look at a damp church. Abigail, I'm on the verge of landing a multi-million-dollar deal that will launch my career, and you want me to take a vacation to watch you scrape paint. Be realistic." The light in her eyes had died. He saw it happen. It was a physical thing, a shutter coming down. She never mentioned the grant or the church again. He had interpreted her silence as her finally understanding his priorities, finally being realistic. He saw now it was the silence of resignation, the silence of a dream being quietly packed away. He realized with a sickening lurch that the passion she was displaying on that stage tonight wasn't new. It hadn't been gifted to her by Alistair Sterling's billions. It had always been there, simmering beneath the surface. He just hadn't thought it was worth paying attention to. He had been so obsessed with the height of his own future skyscrapers that he never noticed the treasure buried right in his own foundation. Sterling's money had not created this woman. It had merely provided her with the platform she had always deserved, the platform he, in his arrogance, had denied her. He had seen her love for history as a quaint, impractical hobby. Sterling, a man who built empires, had seen it for what it was, a deep, powerful, and valuable expertise. The applause for her speech was deafening. It was a genuine, heartfelt ovation. Alistair Sterling was beaming, looking at his wife with a pride so profound it was almost tangible. Jonathan felt 1,000 miles away, an outcast in a world he thought he had conquered. The suit that had felt like armor now felt like a cheap costume. The success he had prided himself on suddenly seemed pathetic and shallow. He had designed buildings that were emotionally sterile because he himself was emotionally sterile. Abigail had tried to tell him, and he hadn't listened. He watched her descend the stage, a queen in her own right, immediately surrounded by admirers and powerful figures eager for a moment of her time. And in the midst of it all, she was poised, gracious, and brilliant. He felt a desperate primal urge to speak to her, to somehow bridge the impossible gulf that now separated them. What would he even say? "I'm sorry I made a mistake. Do you see me now?" The questions were pathetic, the words of a ghost at a feast. He had to try. Driven by an impulse he couldn't control. A toxic cocktail of ego, regret, and a sliver of insane hope, he began to push his way through the crowd. Navigating the throng of people felt like swimming against a powerful current. Each step toward Abigail was a battle. She was the center of a new gravity pulling diplomats, CEOs, and artists into her orbit. Jonathan finally broke through the outer circle just as she was finishing a conversation with a French cultural minister. For a moment she was alone, taking a sip of water a waiter had offered her. This was his chance. He moved forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. Abigail. The name left his lips as a rough, unfamiliar sound. She turned. Her gray eyes, no longer soft and yielding but clear and perceptive, met his. There was a flicker of recognition, but it was distant, like acknowledging a stranger you might have passed on the street once. There was no shock, no anger, no pain. There was nothing. And that absolute placid neutrality was more devastating than any screamed accusation could ever have been. "Jonathan," she said, her voice even and cool. It was a statement of fact, not a greeting. "I was wondering if you were here tonight." Her calmness disarmed him. He had rehearsed a dozen opening lines in the few seconds it took to reach her, but they all evaporated. You're Abigail Sterling." He stammered the words, sounding idiotic as soon as they were spoken. A small, polite smile touched her lips. "I am. It's been a long time." 5 years, he said, his voice regaining some of its strength. He tried to inject a note of shared history, of intimacy. "You look incredible. I almost didn't recognize you." "I know," she said simply. The words hung in the air, a quiet indictment of his blindness. He floundered, searching for an anchor in the conversation. This whole thing. The foundation, the speech. It's amazing, Abby. I had no idea you had this in you. The old nickname slipped out, a relic of a life he had demolished. Her smile tightened ever so slightly at the edges. Few people did. But then, you were never looking very closely, were you, Jonathan? She took another calm sip of water, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't attacking him. She was merely stating a truth, as one might observe that the sky is blue. His ego, raw and wounded, began to flare. I was building a career, he said defensively, for us. No, she corrected him gently, but with the finality of a judge's gavel. You were building a career for you. I was just the temporary scaffolding. It's all right. I found a better architect. Just then a presence materialized beside her. Alistair Sterling put a proprietary but gentle hand on the small of her back. He was taller than Jonathan, and though he was older, he radiated a vitality and certainty that made Jonathan feel like a callow boy. His eyes, a piercing shade of blue, assessed Jonathan in a single sweeping glance that missed nothing. My love is everything, all right? Sterling asked, his voice low and directed only at her. Everything is fine, Alistair, Abigail replied, turning to him. The warmth that flooded her face when she looked at her husband was a stark, painful contrast to the cool composure she showed Jonathan. This is Jonathan Vance. We were once acquainted. Acquainted! The word was a scalpel expertly severing any lingering connection he might have imagined. Sterling extended a hand to Jonathan. His grip was firm, his eyes unblinking. Mr. Vance, my wife has mentioned you. Jonathan's blood ran cold. What had she told him? Had she painted him as the villain, the arrogant fool who had cast her aside, as if reading his mind? Sterling's expression remained perfectly neutral, yet a clear message was being conveyed. I know exactly who you are, and you are of no consequence. Mr. Sterling. Jonathan managed his own hand, feeling clammy. An honor. Your foundation's work is monumental. In fact, my firm has submitted a proposal for the Grand Concourse project. I believe it's precisely the kind of forward-thinking, ambitious design you're looking for. He couldn't help it. The instinct to pitch to salvage something from this disastrous encounter was too deeply ingrained. Abigail's expression didn't change, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It might have been pity. Sterling looked from Jonathan to his wife, a silent question passing between them. He then turned his gaze back to Jonathan. Ah, yes. Vance Design, Sterling said, his tone making the name sound like an obscure footnote. We have entrusted the oversight and final selection for all architectural partners to the new chair of the initiative. She has a unique perspective on the intersection of modern design and historical integrity. The final decisions rest entirely with my wife. The floor dropped out from under Jonathan for the second time that night. He had been pitching to her all along. The reams of paperwork, the expensive renderings, the sleepless nights spent perfecting his proposal, all of it had landed on the desk of the woman whose opinions on architecture he had once laughed at. He looked at Abigail, his face a mask of disbelief. You're on the selection committee. I am the selection committee, Jonathan, she said, her voice devoid of malice but heavy with an undeniable authority. All proposals come through me. He was speechless. The irony was so staggering, so cosmically cruel, that he could do nothing but stare at her. The woman whose passion for the past he had deemed irrelevant was now the sole arbiter of his future. He felt a desperate need to appeal, to explain, to justify himself, but he was cut short. If you'll excuse us, Mr. Vance, Sterling said, his tone polite but unmistakably final. The mayor is waiting to speak with my wife about the project. He guided Abigail away, his hand never leaving her back. As she left, Abigail gave him one last fleeting look over her shoulder. It was not a look of triumph or revenge. It was a look of serene, untroubled closure. She was moving forward into her brilliant future, and he was nothing more than a figure in her past rapidly shrinking in the distance. Jonathan stood rooted to the spot, the cheerful cacophony of the gala washing over him like a distant mocking tide. The conversation, if it could be called that, had lasted no more than 3 minutes, but it had dismantled his entire reality. He felt exposed, stripped bare under the glittering chandeliers. He was no longer a predator on the hunt. He was the prey caught in a trap he hadn't even known existed. He retreated to the periphery of the room, finding a shadowed alcove where he could watch unseen. He saw Abigail, his Abigail, moving through the crowd with her husband. She was a study in grace and power, listening to the mayor with thoughtful intensity, laughing with a tech billionaire, shaking hands with a world-renowned artist. She belonged here. In a way, he realized with a sickening jolt, she belonged here more than he ever would. He had clawed his way into this world using ambition and charm as his tools. She had entered it through the front door, invited in for her intellect and her soul. His mind was a maelstrom of what-ifs. What if he had listened to her that day she'd shown him the Alberti treatise? What if he had taken that trip upstate to the crumbling church? What if he had seen the woman she was, instead of the woman he assumed she should be? The path of his life, which had seemed like a triumphant, self-determined ascent, now looked like a series of catastrophic blunders. He needed to know about his proposal. His entire firm's future was leveraged on the Grand Concourse project. He had taken on debt-hired staff and staked his reputation on securing it. The thought of his fate resting in her hands was unbearable. He pictured her looking at his sleek steel and glass designs, the very epitome of the emotionally sterile style he had championed. He could almost hear her quiet, damning judgment. An hour later, as the crowd began to thin, he saw Robert Harrington again. Jonathan intercepted him with a sense of grim determination. "Robert," he said, his voice tight. Harrington turned a flicker of surprise on his face. "Vance. Still here? I thought you'd be celebrating." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "Celebrating what you haven't heard?" Harrington asked, looking genuinely perplexed. "The announcement. The committee made its final decision on the Grand Concourse architect this afternoon. I assumed someone from your office would have been notified." A cold dread spread through Jonathan's chest. "No, I haven't been notified of anything." "Ah, well," Harrington said with a shrug. "It was a bold move. The selection went to a smaller boutique firm, a partnership, I believe. They call themselves Echo Design Group. Never heard of them before today, but their proposal was, well, it was breathtaking. Mrs. Sterling herself presented it to the board. Said it was the only one that truly understood the brief. Echo Design Group. The name meant nothing to him. "What was their design?" Jonathan asked, his voice hoarse. Harrington's eyes lit up. "Magnificent. Instead of demolishing the old waterfront warehouses, they're preserving the historic brick facades, integrating them into the new structures. They're using reclaimed materials, creating a massive public green space that honors the area's history as a port. It's not just a collection of buildings. It's a conversation with the city's past." Mrs. Sterling's summary was brilliant. She said, "The best architecture doesn't just scrape the sky, it honors the ground it's built on." A powerful sentiment. It honors the ground it's built on. The words were a direct echo of their long-forgotten conversations. It was Abigail's philosophy, her soul translated into steel, glass, and reclaimed brick. She hadn't just rejected his proposal. She had chosen its ideological opposite. She had championed a design that embodied everything he had once mocked. The final crushing blow came as Harrington was turning to leave. "It was a shame about your firm's proposal, though," he added almost as an afterthought. "Beautiful renderings." But the final report from the chair was quite decisive. What did it say? Jonathan had to know. He needed to hear the words. Harrington looked slightly uncomfortable. "Well, it's confidential, of course, but the summary was blunt. It said the design was technically proficient, but ultimately soulless. It praised the ambition, but concluded that it lacked a fundamental respect for the city's history and the community it purports to serve. In the end, it was rejected for having no heart. Technically proficient, but emotionally sterile. The exact words from the rejection letter all those years ago. The words she had tried to help him understand. the words he had ignored. It wasn't revenge. Revenge would have been a loud, fiery explosion. This was something far colder, far more complete. It was justice. It was the dispassionate, logical conclusion of a journey he had set in motion himself. He was the architect of his own ruin, and she had simply signed the demolition order. He didn't remember walking out of the ballroom. He found himself standing on the pavement outside the Pierre, the cool night air a shock against his fevered skin. The city lights blurred around him. The skyscrapers he had so admired, the symbols of power and success he had sacrificed everything for now, seemed like colossal empty monuments to his own hollow ambition. He had gained a kingdom of glass and steel, and in the process had lost the one person who had ever tried to give it a soul. The last guest departed, leaving the grand ballroom in a state of quiet disarray, a battlefield after the conflict littered with discarded napkins and half-empty glasses. On the terrace overlooking Central Park, bathed in the soft glow of the city that never sleeps, Abigail Sterling stood beside her husband. She had taken off her shoes, and the cool stone felt grounding beneath her feet. Alistair draped his jacket over her shoulders. "Are you cold?" "No," she said, leaning her head against his arm. "Just thoughtful." "He found you," Alistair stated. It wasn't a question. He had been watching from afar, ready to intervene at a moment's notice, but he had trusted her to handle it. "He did," she confirmed. "He hasn't changed." "Not really. He's just wearing a more expensive suit." "His proposal was impressive on a technical level," Alistair mused, looking out at the skyline, a landscape Jonathan wanted so badly to dominate. Many on the board would have chosen it. "Impressive isn't the same as important," Abigail said softly. "It was a monument to ego. All sharp angles and cold surfaces. It ignored the people who live in the city, the ghosts of the people who built it. It had nothing to say." She looked up at him. "Echo Design Group." Their proposal sang. Alistair smiled, the expression reaching his shrewd eyes and transforming his entire face. "That it did. You made the right choice. You always do." There was a comfortable silence between them, a shared space built not on grand pronouncements but on countless small moments of understanding and respect. He had met her at a symposium in Florence. She had been delivering a lecture on the chemical erosion of Renaissance-era pigments, and he, sitting in the back of the auditorium, had been captivated not just by her knowledge, but by the quiet, fierce passion with which she spoke. He had sought her out afterward, and they had talked for hours, not about business or balance sheets, but about art history and the meaning of legacy. He was a man who had everything and felt he had nothing of substance. She was a woman who had been told she was nothing, yet carried a world of substance within her. They had recognized in each other a missing piece. He didn't save her. He saw her. He gave her the resources, yes, but her flight was powered by her own wings. "Do you ever think about him?" Alistair asked, his voice gentle, devoid of jealousy. Abigail considered the question. She thought of Jonathan, not the bitter, desperate man she'd seen tonight, but the young, hungry boy she had once loved, the one who dreamed of changing the world with a pencil and a sheet of paper. "I think about the woman I was when I was with him," she answered with quiet honesty. "I was so small. I made my world small to fit inside his. I thought his dreams were the only ones that mattered. Leaving him wasn't the end of my life. It was the beginning. The day he told me I was holding him back, he set me free. He just doesn't know it." She straightened up, a renewed sense of purpose in her eyes. "Enough about the past. Let's talk about the future. I was looking at the preliminary reports for the project in Peru. The Moche temples are in worse shape than we thought." Alistair watched her, his heart swelling with a love that felt more real and more permanent than any skyscraper. He saw the fire in her eyes, the passion that Jonathan had tried and failed to extinguish. Her little hobby was now poised to save wonders of the world. Her legacy would not be written in the fleeting language of stock prices or corporate mergers, but etched into the enduring story of human civilization. Miles away in his sterile minimalist apartment overlooking the city, Jonathan Vance poured himself another drink. The expensive crystal glass felt cold in his hand. He was surrounded by his success, the awards on his shelves, the original modern art on his walls, the panoramic view of the city he'd fought to conquer. But the silence in the apartment was absolute, a crushing void. He looked at the skyline, at the endless towers of light reaching for the heavens. For the first time, he didn't see symbols of triumph. He saw a collection of lonely, empty structures. They were magnificent, ambitious, and technically proficient. And they had no soul. They were a perfect reflection of the man who had designed them. He had built his masterpiece, and now he had to live in it. Alone. 6 months after the gala, the name Jonathan Vance was no longer spoken with envy in the architectural circles of New York. It was a cautionary tale, a whisper of hubris and sudden spectacular collapse. Vance Designs was no more. The sleek office overlooking Bryant Park, once a humming hive of ambition, was now a hollow shell. Jonathan stood in the center of the empty space, the only remaining furniture a single cardboard box containing a few personal effects. The ghost of his firm's logo was still visible on the frosted glass door, a faint outline of a dream that had turned to dust. The bank had called in its loans. His top talent had been poached by competitors, and the Grand Concourse project under the guidance of Echo Design Group was being lauded in the press as a revolutionary new model for urban development. He had lost everything he had sacrificed Abigail for, and the silence in the empty office was his final, crushing invoice. Dressed not in Brioni, but in worn jeans and a simple gray sweater, he picked up the box and walked out, not bothering to look back. He didn't take a cab. He just started walking, his feet carrying him without conscious direction, moving away from the glittering spires of Manhattan and across the bridge into the familiar muted streets of Queens. He found himself in their old neighborhood, a place he hadn't set foot in for 5 years. It was stubbornly the same, the corner bakery, the small park, the low brick buildings. He walked past the apartment they had shared, its windows now holding someone else's life. On a whim driven by a need he didn't understand, he walked into the Queens Historical Society, a small, unassuming museum Abigail had loved. He had teased her for it, calling it a collection of old junk. The air inside was cool and smelled of old paper and wood polish. And that's when he saw her. She was standing in front of a display of faded sepia-toned photographs of the 1939 World's Fair, which had been held nearby. She wasn't wearing an emerald gown or diamonds. She wore simple slacks, a cashmere turtleneck, and her hair was in a loose ponytail. She looked like a more confident, more serene version of the woman he had married. She was alone, completely absorbed in the exhibit. She was just Abigail. He almost turned and fled, but his feet felt bolted to the floor. He had to say something. This felt like the final page of a chapter he had never properly closed. They dreamed of the future so much back then, he said, his voice quiet, startling them both. Abigail turned, and this time her eyes registered him with a calm, unsurprised sadness. "They did," she said. "Sometimes I think they did a better job of imagining it than we do of building it." An awkward silence fell between them. The ghosts of 1,000 arguments and 1,000,000 unspoken thoughts filled the space. "I heard about your firm," she said, her tone gentle without a trace of gloating. "I'm sorry, Jonathan." "Don't be," he replied, the words tasting like rust. "You were right. I read the press on the new design for the concourse. It has a soul. Mine didn't. It took losing everything to finally understand what you were trying to tell me." He looked at her, his gaze stripped of all its former arrogance. "I'm the one who's sorry, Abby, for everything." She looked at him for a long moment, truly looked at him, and he felt as though she could see every broken piece of him. "Do you know what the first official project of the Cultural Heritage Initiative was?" she asked, changing the subject slightly. He shook his head. "It was a small, forgotten church in upstate New York," she said. "The one with the damaged frescoes. We fully restored it. It's beautiful. The local community uses it for concerts and town meetings now. We finished it before the gala, before we even had a name for the initiative. It was the first promise I made to myself. The confession was not meant to wound. It was a simple statement of her own journey. The tiny dream he had belittled and dismissed was the cornerstone of her entire global enterprise. It was the foundation upon which she had built her new life. He finally understood. His ambition had been about size, about scale, about being the biggest. Hers had been about meaning, and it had started small with something she believed in. "That's good," he said, his voice thick. "I'm glad you did that." "The past is important, Jonathan," she said, her gaze drifting back to the old photographs. "But you can't live there. You have to learn from it and then build something new. You're an architect. You know that." She turned to leave, offering him a small final smile. It wasn't a smile of forgiveness, because he knew he hadn't earned that. It was a smile of peace. She was at peace with their history, and her peace only highlighted his own internal war. "Abigail," he called out one last time. She paused at the door. "What will you do now?" she asked. "I don't know," he said with raw honesty. "For the first time in my life, I don't have a blueprint. Maybe I'll start with the foundation." She nodded once, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement, and then she was gone. Jonathan stood alone in the museum, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. For years he had tried to outrun his. Now, in the ruins of his life, he knew the only way forward was to turn and finally face them. The city outside was waiting, no longer a prize to be won, but a story to be understood, and for the first time he was ready to learn how to read it. The story of Jonathan Vance and Abigail Sterling isn't just about a failed marriage or a shocking reversal of fortune. It's a powerful reminder that true value is often hidden in plain sight, dismissed by those too arrogant to see. It's about the quiet strength that blossoms in the wake of heartbreak, and the enduring power of a passion that is nurtured instead of belittled. Abigail's victory wasn't marrying a billionaire. It was becoming the woman she was always meant to be on her own terms. It's a testament to the idea that the most magnificent structures are not built on ego, but on a foundation of soul respect and a deep understanding of the past. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to hit the like button and share it with someone who might appreciate a tale of strength and poetic justice. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story. What are your thoughts on Jonathan's fate? Let us know in the comments below.